In this video tutorial, I'm going to show you how to put your observations in for Lab 3. It's similar to what we did in Lab 1, except this time we're going to observe just a single object, one of the four gas giants, so Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, or Neptune, and we're going to observe it repeatedly. In this particular lab, we're going to observe it once a day for a total of 14 days, but I'm going to show you how to do that with one observing request to automatically repeat, instead of having to put the request in 14 separate times. Now, you probably won't get all 14 observations back because you will be weathered out sometimes, but you should get most of them back. And really, you only need 5 or 6 to complete this lab. Though the more you have, the easier it is to see the pattern. In either case, you want to put the observation in right away, because it does take time to collect this data, up to 2 weeks. You want to have enough time to do the analysis on your collected images and submit the lab before the due date. So I'm going to share my screen and show you how to put in a repeating observation in Skynet. Okay, here we are at Skynet, and this begins just like in Lab 1. I'm going to go to My Observatory, Optical Observing, add a new observation. Now we have to pick our target. And again, we're going to observe one of the gas giants. And some of them, like Jupiter and Saturn, they're pleasing to look at. They're nearby, they're big. We can see features on their surfaces. We can see the banded cloud structure of Jupiter, the rings of Saturn. But this lab is really about the moons. For each system, we've selected a moon, and you're going to figure out the orbit of that moon, which means you're going to have to identify that moon in each of your images. And the different gas giants, they present different challenges. Some are easier, some are harder in terms of identifying that moon. Jupiter, being nearby, the moons are spread out. There are only 4 moons, the Galilean satellites, and they're all large moons, which means they're fairly bright. And so they're easy to separate from one another. It makes moon identification pretty straightforward. The only caveat is Ganymede, which is the moon that you'll use if your target's Jupiter, is sometimes off the edge of the image, at least the telescopes with smaller format cameras. So you may lose your moon in some of the images, but it'll be there in most of them. Saturn is farther away, so the moons are concentrated more towards the center of the image. The moons never move off the image, yet they're still fairly well separated, distinct from one another. You're going to be looking for Titan, and pretty easy to identify. Uranus is even farther away, so the moons are clustered even more tightly in the center of the image, and none of those are large moons, so they're all kind of faint. They're all clustered around the planet. Some are lost in the glow of the planet. They're all on top of each other. That makes moon identification a little bit more challenging. So if you want a challenge, Uranus is your target. And then there's Neptune, and Neptune's the easiest in terms of moon identification because there's only one visible moon, Triton, and it's right next to the planet, as we saw in Lab 1, so you don't even need to use stellarium. You can identify the moon fairly easily. Okay, let's try Jupiter. Looked it up, found it, it's right here in the sky. Let's check our 3 numbers. We want this to be -12, 20, and 0.5, just like in Lab 1. We don't need the advanced settings. And then we check the air mass chart just to make sure our gas giant is above the gray line somewhere. And indeed, we have multiple observatories. These ones that come way up here, these are the Southern Hemisphere observatories. So it's very high in the sky in the Southern Hemisphere right now, and it's visible low in the sky at the end of the night in the Northern Hemisphere. So many opportunities. Okay, so next we're going to choose our filters. And for this, you consult the laboratory manual for each of the planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. There are different recommended filters and different recommended exposure durations. I'm looking at it right now, and it says Jupiter, I want the V band. So select V. Again, we lose some telescopes because some telescopes didn't have that filter, but there are plenty of them here that do. So I'm going to continue on. Now we're into telescope selection. And if you have plenty of time, I would go with prompt telescopes, just because there are many telescopes on the system. They're very high quality, but some of them are campus observatories and some of them are in cities. But the prompt telescopes, these are telescopes that we've built at some of the best locations on the planet, and they're fairly reliable and they're on the network most clear nights. So if you still have plenty of time before the lab is due, I would select prompt telescopes. If you're running out of time and you're getting desperate and you need those 5 or 6 observations, then just press the orange button for your particular time account, and it will select every telescope that you have access to. But I have plenty of time before this is due, so I'm just going to select prompt telescopes. Here's a prompt telescope. Okay, so I've selected this one in Australia, these 3 in Chile. Save and continue. Now we pick our design telescope, either prompt 5 or the generic 16-inch back illuminated. And again, we consult the lab. We want 1 exposure, and for Jupiter, it's going to be 0.03 seconds. It's different for different planets, so check the lab. And you can see as I go to different telescopes, that's 0.03, 0.03, 0.04 seconds. And prompt 8, that's a larger telescope, so it would only need 0.01 seconds to do this observation, and that's actually too short. And so it's been crossed off. But we still have 3 telescopes. Okay, so far everything's been pretty much the same as in Lab 1. This is the part that's different. This is where we set it up to repeat. It's here under the advanced options. The tab may be closed, just open it up. And a couple things you want to check. First, you want to make sure this is marked. Continue on next available telescope if interrupted. It should be marked by default, but just check. Basically, if you start on a particular telescope and that telescope goes offline due to maintenance or maybe a bad stretch of weather, it will switch to a different telescope. So you definitely want to have that checked. And then down here, check this, repeat this observation. And in this particular lab, we're going to repeat it 14 times with at least 1 day between each. Okay? Then we save and continue. Slide on down. Submit. Okay, and here it is. And you want to come and check it periodically. Make sure your observations are coming in. Make sure nothing's wrong. Slide down here and see if I have another one. Here's Saturn, where I did 14 observations. You can see we got them all back from various prompt telescopes. If I click on it, you can see Saturn's there. And you may not be able to see the moons on the Skynet view. But of course, once you put it into Afterglow and adjust the brightness and contrast, you'll be able to see the moons as well. All right, so do not delay. Put those observations in right away.